The first snow of December drifted silently across Ashcombe Manor, settling upon the ancient rooftops and frost-silvered gardens like a memory no one dared disturb. For winters had passed since Duchess Eleanor Ashcombe breathed her last, yet the great estate still carried the weight of that single sorrow. Once, laughter had echoed through every corridor, candles had glowed in every window, and music had poured from every room until even the servants found themselves humming as they worked. Now the manor seemed determined to remember only silence. The grand ballroom remained locked, the chapel organ gathered dust, and the magnificent Christmas tree that had once stood proudly in the entrance hall had not been raised since the Duchess's passing. Duke Rowan Ashcombe stood before the drawing-room window, watching flakes disappear into the grey morning sky. At 37, he remained every inch the nobleman admired throughout the county, tall, composed, impeccably dressed, but grief had quietly stolen the warmth from his expression. His dark hair was touched with the faintest hint of silver at the temples, and the quiet confidence that had once inspired every servant now seemed replaced by endless restraint. He had not celebrated Christmas since losing the only woman he had ever loved. For Rowan, the season no longer carried joy. It carried echoes. Behind him, 12-year-old Henry Ashcombe carefully unpacked a small wooden box from a cabinet that had remained unopened for years. Inside lay fragile glass ornaments wrapped in yellowing linen, each one crafted by his mother long ago. He lifted a painted star with trembling fingers, studying it as though afraid it might vanish. "I think Lucy deserves one proper Christmas," he said softly without looking at his father. "She barely remembers what mother made it feel like." Rowan remained silent. 9-year-old Lucy wandered into the room moments later, hugging a faded velvet angel against her chest. Her golden curls framed eyes far older than a child should have been. She looked toward the empty fireplace before quietly asking, "May we decorate the house this year, Father? Just a little?" The question hung between them. Rowan slowly turned from the window. Their hopeful faces reminded him painfully of Eleanor, who had believed every Christmas deserved beauty no matter how difficult life became. For several long seconds he struggled against memories he had spent years trying to bury. Finally he nodded once. "Only for you both." Lucy's face brightened instantly, and Henry released a breath he had not realized he had been holding. Preparations began that afternoon. Servants climbed ladders to polish forgotten chandeliers. Evergreen branches arrived from the forest. Boxes of candles were carried from storage, and garlands slowly returned to the grand staircase. Yet despite the movement, the manor still lacked something impossible to replace. Decorations could imitate Christmas, but they could not restore its spirit. Because so much work had accumulated after years of neglect, Rowan instructed the housekeeper to hire several seasonal workers who would remain only until New Year's Day. Among those who arrived at the servants' entrance the following morning was a young woman carrying little more than a small traveling case and a neatly folded wool shawl. Her name was Clara Winslow. At 25, Clara possessed an easy kindness that revealed itself before she spoke a single word. Soft chestnut curls escaped beneath her white maid's cap, framing a face brightened by warm hazel eyes and an unforced smile. Her dress was plain, carefully mended in several places, but perfectly clean. She greeted every servant with quiet courtesy, thanked the stable boy who carried her case, and immediately offered to help an elderly cook lift heavy baskets before anyone assigned her duties. Mrs. Talbot, the stern housekeeper who rarely complimented newcomers, watched the young woman for several minutes before murmuring, "You'll do nicely here." Clara smiled. "I hope so." She threw herself into every task with cheerful determination. She polished silver until it gleamed, dusted forgotten portraits with remarkable care, and treated every room as though someone precious still lived there. Whenever she passed a servant struggling beneath a burden, she instinctively stopped to help. By evening, nearly everyone on the estate knew her name. Only the Duke had scarcely noticed she existed. To him she was simply another temporary employee who would disappear when winter ended. The following morning dawned clear but bitterly cold. Frost covered the ancient stone well beyond the manor gardens, and thin sheets of ice floated upon its dark water. Before breakfast, Mrs. Talbot sent Clara outside to draw fresh buckets for the kitchens. Wrapping her shawl tighter against the wind, Clara crossed the snowy courtyard. The old well stood beside a weathered oak whose bare branches reached toward the pale winter sky. Everything around her felt hushed, as though the entire estate were listening to the snowfall. She lowered the iron bucket into the well. The pulley creaked gently. As she waited for it to fill, an old melody drifted into her thoughts without invitation. Almost absent-mindedly, she began humming. Then humming became singing. The hymn floated softly across the frozen gardens, delicate as falling snow. Every phrase rose and settled with an unusual rhythm, each pause carefully placed, every breath lingering exactly where the melody seemed to whisper instead of speak. At the end of each verse came a barely audible smile within the music itself, followed by a light, joyful laugh that escaped before the final note faded away. Henry, carrying kindling across the courtyard, stopped so abruptly that the bundle slipped from his arms. Lucy stepped onto the terrace behind him, listening with widening eyes. Neither child moved. Neither breathed. Their faces drained of color as recognition struck with impossible force. Inside the library, Rowan looked up from his desk the instant the distant melody reached the open window. The pen slipped from his fingers. His heartbeat thundered as memories he had fought for 4 relentless years came rushing back with unbearable clarity. He strode quickly through the corridor, pushed open the great front doors, and hurried toward the old stone well just as Clara reached the hymn's final whispered line. Then came the gentle laugh. Exactly as Eleanor had always ended it. The courtyard fell utterly silent. Henry's voice trembled almost beyond sound as tears filled his eyes. "Father," he whispered. "She sings like mother." Rowan stared at the young maid in stunned disbelief, unable to tear his eyes from her face. At last his voice emerged, low and unsteady. "Miss Winslow," he said. "Tell me, where did you learn that impossible song?" Rowan's question lingered in the frozen air long after the final note had disappeared. Clara lowered her eyes, suddenly uncertain why everyone around the old stone well appeared as though they had witnessed a miracle. The iron bucket still dripped into the snow, yet no one seemed to hear the splashing water. Every servant stood motionless. Henry's cheeks were wet with tears, while Lucy pressed trembling fingers against her lips, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile memory had settled over the courtyard. Clara swallowed nervously before answering. "I learned it when I was very young, Your Grace." Rowan took one slow step closer. "From whom?" She searched her memory with genuine effort. I don't know her name. I was only a little girl then. She was kind. She smiled all the time, even during the coldest mornings. She taught the children songs while we carried firewood and decorated a tiny chapel in a mountain village." Henry exchanged a startled glance with Lucy. Clara continued softly, unaware of the storm her words created. "There was an elderly blind woman who wrote beautiful music. We called her Mrs. Bell. The lady helped her every Christmas. She taught us to sing slowly, to breathe gently between certain words, and never to rush the ending because she said Christmas should sound like hope arriving home." Rowan felt his pulse quicken. The instructions were identical. Not merely the melody, the breathing, the pauses, even the joyful laugh. Only Eleanor had ever sung the hymn that way. Unable to endure another unanswered question, Rowan dismissed everyone except Clara with unusual courtesy before retreating to the private west wing of the manor. The heavy oak door of Eleanor's old sitting room creaked open for the first time in years. Dust floated through narrow beams of winter sunlight, illuminating furniture preserved exactly as she had left it. Her embroidery basket still rested beside the window. A pressed sprig of holly remained tucked inside an unfinished book. The room smelled faintly of cedar and dried lavender, as though time itself had refused to disturb her presence. Rowan crossed to an elegant walnut writing desk. His fingers hesitated above the locked drawer. He had promised himself never to open it again. Today that promise yielded to something stronger than grief. The tiny brass key still hung beneath the desk exactly where Eleanor had always hidden it. The lock clicked softly. Inside rested neatly tied bundles of letters, several sketchbooks, and a collection of leather journals arranged by year. Beneath a faded green ribbon lay one volume unlike the others. Across its cover Eleanor had written in graceful ink, "Mountain Christmases." Rowan opened it carefully. The first pages described snow-covered cottages, hungry children, homemade lantern festivals, and evenings spent singing beside crackling fires. Eleanor never mentioned titles, wealth, or noble obligations. She simply called herself a volunteer among friends. Page after page revealed another life she had quietly lived before becoming Duchess. She had traveled every December to the isolated mountain village, bringing blankets, books, medicine, and music to abandoned children. She insisted nobody know her family name because kindness, she wrote, should never depend upon applause. Rowan smiled sadly. That belief was entirely Eleanor. Tucked between 2 pages slipped a folded charcoal sketch. He unfolded it with trembling hands. Several laughing children stood outside a tiny stone chapel beneath falling snow. At the center was a little girl with lively curls, clutching a lantern almost too large for her small hands. His breath caught. The child possessed Clara's unmistakable smile. Below the drawing Eleanor had written, "Little Clara sings as though Christmas itself lives inside her. Today she remembered every pause without my help. One day she will remind someone that joy survives even the longest winter." Rowan closed his eyes. His wife had known Clara. Not briefly. Not by chance. She had taught her. Meanwhile, the atmosphere throughout Ashcombe Manor changed almost imperceptibly. Clara knew nothing of Rowan's discovery. She simply devoted herself to preparing the estate for Christmas with tireless enthusiasm. Instead of expensive decorations, she gathered pine cones, dried orange slices, cinnamon sticks, and evergreen branches, arranging them with simple elegance that made every hallway feel welcoming again. Lucy followed her constantly. Together they baked gingerbread biscuits shaped like little stars and birds. Clara showed her how to press lace into the dough before baking so delicate patterns appeared across each biscuit. The kitchen, silent for years, filled with laughter whenever Lucy dusted flour across her own nose by accident. Henry remained quieter, yet he watched Clara closely. He noticed how she thanked every servant by name, repaired a broken toy belonging to the scullery maid's son without mentioning it, and always left the warmest rolls for elderly groundskeeper Mr. Ellis before serving herself. None of her kindness felt deliberate. It simply seemed woven into who she was. One afternoon Clara discovered forgotten wooden boxes in the attic filled with handmade ornaments. Instead of storing them again, she carefully polished every painted angel, ribbon, and glass star before inviting Henry and Lucy to help decorate the great tree standing proudly in the entrance hall. As Lucy reached to hang a tiny silver bell, she whispered, "Mother always said bells help lonely hearts find home." Clara smiled gently. "She sounds very wise." Lucy nodded. She was. That evening candles glowed throughout the manor for the first time since Eleanor's death. Warm golden light danced across polished floors while fresh pine scented the corridors. Even longtime servants admitted the house somehow felt alive again. Not everyone welcomed the change. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne arrived the following afternoon in an elegant carriage trimmed with crimson velvet. Beautiful, poised, and impeccably dressed, she greeted Rowan with polished affection while secretly expecting this Christmas to secure the marriage she had quietly pursued since Eleanor's passing. Instead, she found Henry helping Clara hang garlands across the library doorway. Lucy laughed as Clara lifted her high enough to place a paper star atop the tree. Even Rowan, standing nearby, allowed the faintest smile to escape. Beatrice's own smile stiffened. She had visited Ashcombe Manor for 4 consecutive Christmases, patiently waiting for grief to loosen its hold upon Rowan's heart. Yet within days, one unknown maid had accomplished what she never could. That evening Beatrice stood unnoticed outside the small manor chapel. Through the open doorway she watched Clara arranging candles before softly singing the mysterious hymn once more. Henry and Lucy listened with shining eyes, while Rowan remained hidden in the shadows, unable to leave even after the final note faded. Beatrice slowly tightened her gloved hands. Her expression hardened beneath the flickering candlelight. "If she remains here until Christmas morning," she whispered to herself, "I shall lose far more than Rowan's attention." She turned quietly into the darkness, already deciding that Miss Clara Winslow would never be allowed to stay long enough to become part of the Ashcombe family. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne wore grace as convincingly as a queen wore a crown. Every smile appeared sincere, every compliment perfectly measured, and every gesture reflected polished refinement. Yet beneath that elegant composure, resentment grew stronger with every passing day. Clara Winslow remained at Ashcombe Manor. She had arrived expecting to become the comforting presence Rowan would eventually choose as his Duchess. Instead, she found herself watching a humble Christmas maid accomplish in a week what she had failed to achieve in 4 long years. The manor no longer echoed with silence. Candles glowed again. Fresh evergreens scented the corridors. Servants laughed while working. Worst of all, Henry and Lucy looked happier beside Clara than they had since their mother's death. Beatrice refused to accept it. She began planting quiet seeds of doubt throughout the household. While speaking with maids in the laundry room, she sighed sadly and remarked, "Some people understand exactly how lonely children can be. Winning their affection is often the quickest path into a noble family." The words sounded harmless. Their meaning was not. Soon whispers drifted through servants' passages. Perhaps Miss Winslow enjoyed too much attention. Perhaps her kindness was carefully practiced. Perhaps no ordinary maid could accidentally know the Duchess's secret hymn. Clara remained blissfully unaware. She spent her mornings helping Lucy stitch tiny felt stars onto stockings and her afternoons teaching Henry how to carve delicate wooden snowflakes from discarded branches. Whenever either child spoke about Eleanor, Clara listened with quiet respect rather than trying to replace their memories. She never compared herself with the late Duchess. Instead, she encouraged the children to tell stories about their mother until both found themselves smiling through tears instead of hiding them. Watching those moments only deepened Beatrice's determination. One rainy afternoon she wandered alone into the locked music room, pretending to admire Eleanor's old piano. Hidden inside a carved walnut cabinet rested the Duchess's treasured Christmas music box, a silver and ivory keepsake Rowan had commissioned during their first Christmas together. When wound, it played the very hymn Eleanor had taught only a handful of children in the distant mountain village. Rowan had not opened the cabinet since her funeral. Beatrice carefully removed the music box. She wrapped it inside a linen cloth and concealed it beneath her cloak before slipping silently through the servants' corridor. That evening, while Clara helped Mrs. Talbot prepare mulled cider in the kitchens, Beatrice quietly entered the maid's tiny bedroom. The room contained almost nothing. A neatly folded blanket, a small Bible, one worn traveling case, a faded ribbon. She hesitated only a moment before hiding the music box beneath Clara's bed inside the traveling case. When she closed the lid, guilt flickered briefly across her face. Then ambition extinguished it. The following morning the manor awoke to panic. Rowan had finally decided to unlock the music cabinet and show Henry and Lucy the keepsake their mother cherished every Christmas. The cabinet stood open. The shelf was empty. Every servant immediately began searching. Rooms were inspected. Cupboards emptied. Drawers opened. No one escaped suspicion. Clara volunteered to help without hesitation. She searched attics, kitchens, and storage rooms until Mrs. Talbot quietly entered her bedroom. Moments later an astonished gasp echoed down the corridor. Everyone gathered outside. Mrs. Talbot emerged holding Eleanor's silver music box. The housekeeper's face reflected more sorrow than anger. It was found inside Miss Winslow's case. Silence crushed the hallway. Clara stared at the music box in complete disbelief. "I have never seen that before." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I swear it." No one answered. Henry stepped forward immediately. "She didn't do it." Mrs. Talbot looked conflicted. "The evidence is difficult to ignore." Lucy ran toward Clara, clutching her apron. "Tell them you didn't." "I didn't." Clara gently embraced the frightened girl. "I truly didn't." Rowan remained perfectly still. His heart urged him to believe Clara. His eyes struggled against what lay plainly before him. Grief had already taught him how easily hope could deceive. After a long silence he spoke with quiet restraint. "Miss Winslow, until the matter is understood, I must ask you to surrender your duties." The words visibly wounded him. They devastated Clara. She bowed respectfully despite tears gathering in her eyes. "If that is your wish, your grace." Lucy burst into tears. Henry clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. As Clara slowly walked upstairs, not one servant met her eyes. Only Henry watched her disappear. His instincts refused to surrender. That afternoon he replayed every detail in his mind. Clara had been with Mrs. Talbot almost constantly. She had never visited her room. Then another memory surfaced. 2 evenings earlier he had seen Lady Beatrice emerging from the servants' hallway. At the time he thought nothing of it. Now the image refused to leave him. Meanwhile Lucy remembered something different. She had wandered upstairs searching for Clara after supper and noticed Beatrice adjusting her gloves outside the maid's door. When asked about it, Beatrice merely smiled and claimed she had become lost. Henry's suspicion sharpened. Neither child wished to accuse anyone unfairly. Instead they quietly began observing. Over the next day Beatrice behaved with perfect confidence, yet Henry noticed she often glanced toward Rowan, carefully measuring whether Clara's absence had softened his resolve. Lucy observed something else. Every time servants discussed the missing truth, Beatrice gently redirected conversations away from herself while expressing graceful sympathy for everyone involved. The children exchanged uneasy looks. That evening the annual Christmas banquet filled the great dining hall with candlelight and restrained conversation. Clara remained absent, confined to her room until Rowan decided what should happen next. Empty space at the servants' table felt strangely painful. Even longtime footmen admitted the house seemed colder without her cheerful voice. During dessert Henry deliberately walked behind Beatrice's chair carrying a silver tray. He stumbled. The tray slipped harmlessly onto the carpet. At the same moment Beatrice's elegant sewing basket toppled beside her. Spools of silk scattered across the polished floor. Needles rolled beneath chairs. A folded square of embroidered linen slid into the open. Lucy froze. She recognized it instantly. It perfectly matched the cloth Mrs. Talbot described wrapping the stolen music box. Mrs. Talbot quietly picked it up. Her expression changed. "This is from the music cabinet." Beatrice's face paled. Before she could answer, a trembling kitchen maid suddenly burst into tears. "I helped her," the young servant sobbed. "Lady Beatrice promised me money if I placed the music box inside Miss Winslow's case. She said nobody would ever question a Duchess's cousin." Gasps swept through the hall. Rowan rose slowly from his chair. His disappointment carried far greater weight than anger. "You sought to destroy an innocent woman because my children found comfort after years of sorrow." Beatrice opened her mouth, searching desperately for dignity. Instead she found only silence. Rowan's voice remained calm. "You will leave Ashcombe Manor before sunrise and never return." No one objected. Not even Beatrice herself. She departed the dining hall without another word, her footsteps echoing through corridors she had once hoped to rule. Later, Rowan climbed the narrow staircase toward Clara's room carrying the recovered music box in his hands. He paused outside her door, overcome by shame for doubting the woman Eleanor herself had once loved as a child. Before he could knock, his gaze settled upon the polished silver lid. Reflected within it were his own weary eyes beside Eleanor's engraved initials. At that quiet moment he understood something that unsettled him more deeply than Beatrice's betrayal. Someone had not merely tried to frame Clara. Someone had tried to erase the final living bridge between his children and the woman they still called mother, and he suddenly feared the battle for Christmas had only begun. Christmas Eve arrived beneath a sky the color of forged steel. Heavy clouds rolled across the valley, swallowing the pale winter sun until afternoon looked like twilight. By noon, fierce winds swept over Ashcombe Manor, bending ancient pines and scattering snow into blinding white curtains. Stable doors rattled against their hinges while servants hurried to secure wagons before the storm reached its full fury. Every experienced farmer predicted the same thing. Anyone caught beyond the village before nightfall might never find the road home again. Inside the manor, Rowan personally apologized to Clara for doubting her innocence. He returned Eleanor's treasured music box with both hands, his expression filled with quiet regret. "I failed you," he admitted. "I allowed grief to cloud my judgment." Clara accepted neither apology nor keepsake immediately. Instead she smiled with gentle understanding. "Grief makes kind people afraid, Your Grace. It does not make them cruel." Her forgiveness humbled him far more deeply than any accusation could have done. Henry and Lucy embraced Clara with joyful relief, and laughter returned once more to the great hall. Yet beyond the stained-glass windows, the storm continued gathering strength, as though the peaceful reunion had arrived moments before something far greater. Near sunset, frantic knocking shattered the calm. A soaked messenger stumbled into the entrance hall, gasping for breath. "The bridge road has vanished beneath drifting snow," he cried. "Several families are trapped near St. Gabriel's Chapel. The warning bell hasn't rung. They don't know the storm is worsening." Every face turned toward Rowan. The old chapel stood high upon the mountain pass where narrow roads twisted between rocky cliffs. For generations, its great bronze bell warned travelers whenever dangerous weather approached. Without that signal, anyone crossing the ridge could easily become lost in the blizzard. Rowan ordered horses saddled immediately. Before anyone could leave, the messenger added another dreadful detail. "The bell rope snapped yesterday." Silence settled over the room. Without the rope, the bell could not be rung from below. The nearest blacksmith lived hours away. There was no time for repairs. Clara suddenly stepped forward. "I know that chapel." Everyone looked at her. "I lived near those mountains as a child. There's a narrow stair inside the bell tower." Mrs. Talbot shook her head instantly. "The steps freeze during storms." Clara nodded. "I remember." She wrapped a heavy cloak around her shoulders. "If someone reaches the bell by hand, the sound will carry through the valley." Rowan understood immediately what she intended. "It's too dangerous. So is leaving those families without warning." Her calm reply left no room for argument. Within minutes they departed. Snow lashed against their faces as horses struggled through rising drifts. The journey that normally required half an hour stretched painfully longer while icy winds erased the road beneath fresh snowfall. Henry and Lucy remained safely at the manor with trusted servants, praying beside the Christmas candles their mother once lit every Christmas Eve. When the chapel finally emerged through the storm, it appeared almost swallowed by white darkness. Ancient stone walls groaned beneath relentless wind, while broken shutters slammed violently against weathered windows. The bell tower rose above everything, its narrow peak disappearing into swirling snow. Clara rushed inside. The spiral staircase twisted upward through freezing shadows. Every worn stone step glittered with dangerous ice. She climbed carefully at first, one hand gripping the frozen railing. Higher. Higher still. Halfway upward the staircase narrowed until fierce drafts poured through broken openings in the walls. Snowflakes drifted inside like tiny ghosts. Her fingers numbed despite thick gloves, and each breath became harder than the last. Far below, Rowan entered the chapel and looked upward. Clara. His voice echoed through the tower. Come back. She paused only long enough to answer. If I stop now, they'll never hear the bell. Then she continued climbing. At last she reached the bell chamber. The heavy rope hung uselessly several feet below the great bronze bell where its upper length had torn completely away. Thick ice coated the enormous wheel supporting the bell, leaving no simple way to move it. Clara studied the mechanism. Only one possibility remained. She climbed onto the frozen wooden framework itself. Balancing carefully above the open beams, she wrapped both arms around the iron support and threw her weight against the massive bell. Nothing happened. She pushed again. The bell shifted only slightly. Below, Rowan reached the tower entrance. He saw Clara silhouetted high above against swirling snow. His heart nearly stopped. One misplaced step would send her plunging through the empty chamber. Please, he shouted. Come down. She remembered another winter. Another chapel. Another smiling woman whose gentle voice always carried hope. Again Clara, that voice had once encouraged. You are stronger than fear. Closing her eyes, Clara summoned every remaining ounce of strength. She pushed with all her weight. The great bell finally moved. A deep bronze note thundered across the mountains. Then another. And another. The powerful sound rolled through snowy valleys, echoing from cliff to cliff like heaven calling travelers home. Far below, scattered lanterns suddenly changed direction. Families turned their wagons toward the chapel instead of continuing deeper into the mountains. Rowan watched tiny lights slowly gathering through the storm. The bell had reached them. Relief flooded his chest. Then disaster struck. A thick layer of ice broke beneath Clara's boots. The wooden beam cracked sharply. She slipped. For one terrifying heartbeat she dangled above the empty tower, clinging desperately to an iron brace with both hands. Rowan raced upward without hesitation. Ignoring every warning shouted behind him, he climbed the frozen staircase until he reached the bell chamber. Stretching dangerously across the fractured beams, he caught Clara's wrist just as her grip weakened. Don't let go, he whispered. I won't, she answered. Together they fought their way back onto solid flooring. Only when both collapsed safely beside the bell did Rowan realize his hands were shaking uncontrollably. Outside, voices gradually filled the chapel yard. The trapped travelers had arrived. Among them walked an elderly blind woman wrapped in a weathered wool cloak. Though age had bent her shoulders, dignity still surrounded her gentle face. The instant Clara spoke while helping frightened children inside, the old woman's expression transformed. She reached forward with trembling hands. That voice, she whispered. She gently touched Clara's cheek. My little Christmas bird. Tears filled Clara's eyes. Mrs. Bell? The elderly composer smiled through her own tears. I knew someday your song would lead me back to her family. She turned toward Rowan. Your Grace, your Eleanor kept a promise no one else ever knew. For 3 Christmases she came to our forgotten village without revealing she was a duchess. She fed hungry children, mended torn coats, and taught music beside me. Before she left for the final time, she looked at Clara and said, If this child ever reaches my husband and my little ones, they will recognize not my voice but my heart. She will remind them that sorrow must never become the last song they sing. Rowan stood speechless as snow drifted quietly through the chapel doorway. Everything he had believed impossible suddenly fit together with breathtaking clarity. Eleanor had never truly hidden her greatest gift inside journals, ornaments, or treasured keepsakes. She had hidden it inside a little girl who unknowingly carried hope across the years, and as Rowan looked at Clara through the falling snow, he realized Christmas had not returned to Ashcombe Manor by accident. It had been lovingly prepared long before grief ever entered their lives. Christmas morning dawned beneath a sky washed clean by the night's storm. Fresh snow rested across the hills surrounding Ashcombe Manor like a blanket of white velvet, while sunlight broke gently through pale clouds, scattering diamonds of light across every frozen branch. For the first time in 4 long years, the estate no longer felt imprisoned by grief. The laughter of servants drifted through open corridors, the scent of warm cinnamon bread floated from the kitchens, and every window glowed with candlelight that Eleanor herself would once have lit before sunrise. Rowan stood alone beside the old stone well where everything had begun. The weathered stones wore garlands of evergreen and holly, while tiny lanterns hung from the ancient oak overhead. Only days earlier this place had awakened impossible memories. Now it had become something different. It had become a place where sorrow had finally met hope. Behind him came familiar footsteps. Henry walked beside Lucy, both dressed in their finest Christmas clothes. Henry carried himself a little taller than before, as though the burdens he had silently carried since losing his mother had finally become lighter. Lucy held a small basket filled with handmade ornaments she and Clara had crafted together during quiet evenings beside the fire. Finally Clara approached. She wore a simple forest green winter dress trimmed with white wool, modest and elegant without a trace of vanity. Snowflakes settled softly upon her chestnut curls as she smiled toward the family waiting beside the well. No one spoke immediately. The silence felt peaceful. Rowan finally broke it. "Would you sing it once more?" Clara hesitated. "I never wished to cause pain." "You no longer do," Rowan answered gently. "Now it reminds us why Christmas was always worth keeping." Clara nodded. She closed her eyes. The familiar hymn rose softly into the crisp winter air. Every breath rested exactly where Eleanor had once placed it. Every whispered phrase carried quiet warmth. The melody drifted across the snow-covered gardens until even distant stable hands removed their hats to listen. This time Henry quietly joined the second verse. His voice trembled at first, then steadied. Lucy smiled through tears before adding her own gentle harmony. When the final verse arrived, Rowan himself began singing for the first time since Eleanor's death. His voice remained deep and quiet, carrying years of grief alongside newly discovered peace. When Clara reached the final note, she laughed softly exactly as she always had. This time no one cried because the laugh sounded like a ghost. They cried because it no longer did. When the hymn ended, Rowan reached into the pocket of his coat and carefully unfolded a weathered page from Eleanor's final Christmas journal. "I found this after opening the last pages of her diary." His voice caught. "I think she wanted us to hear it only when we were ready." He began reading. "If Christmas ever returns to this house after I am gone, do not be afraid of it. Love does not dishonor the people we lose by welcoming joy again. Grief is proof that love existed, but it must never become the prison where love ends. If another kind soul one day helps my children laugh without guilt, welcome that gift with open hands. It will not replace me. It will fulfill the promise I pray heaven allows me to keep." Silence settled once again. Lucy quietly wiped her eyes. "I think Mother knew." Henry nodded slowly. "She always knew." Rowan folded the letter with extraordinary care before turning toward Clara. "You came here believing you were only hired for Christmas." She smiled softly. "I did. You have become something far more precious than a servant." Clara lowered her eyes. "I've only done what anyone should." "No," Henry answered. "You stayed." Lucy stepped forward, gently taking Clara's hand. "Everyone else kept telling us to stop talking about Mother because it made people sad." She looked up with innocent honesty. "You listened every single time." Clara squeezed her hand. "She deserves to be remembered." "And so do you," Lucy whispered. Rowan looked toward the old manor, then back at Clara. "My wife once believed kindness should never seek recognition." He paused. "You have lived by that same belief." His expression grew unexpectedly vulnerable. "I cannot imagine this house without you." Clara's heart quickened. "Your Grace." "I am not asking you to answer today." He smiled for the first time without sadness shadowing it. "I am only asking whether you would remain at Ashcombe Manor after Christmas, not as a maid but as our music teacher, our friend, and a permanent member of this household." Emotion filled Clara's eyes. She had spent most of her life believing she belonged nowhere for very long. Now someone offered her a home without demanding she earn it. She nodded quietly. "I would like that very much." The children embraced her before she could say anything more. Laughter echoed across the gardens. Mrs. Talbot watched from the manor steps, smiling into her handkerchief while pretending to supervise breakfast preparations. Months passed. Winter slowly yielded to spring, spring blossomed into summer, and every season carried fresh reminders that healing rarely arrived in dramatic moments. It came through ordinary mornings shared over breakfast, afternoons spent teaching music in the schoolroom, quiet walks through blooming gardens, and evenings when Rowan discovered himself laughing without first apologizing to Eleanor's memory. Their friendship grew naturally. Neither hurried it. Neither feared it. When autumn returned, Henry quietly approached his father in the library. "You love her?" Rowan smiled faintly. "I do." Henry considered that answer before replying. "Then you're finally listening to Mother." On the first anniversary of Clara's arrival, Ashcombe Manor prepared for another Christmas. This time the decorations appeared brighter than ever. Villagers gathered inside the small manor chapel, whose windows shimmered beneath falling snow. Mrs. Agnes Bell, though older and leaning upon a carved walking stick, insisted upon conducting the choir herself. When Rowan entered wearing a simple dark mourning coat, every guest rose respectfully. Moments later Clara appeared at the chapel doorway in an ivory winter wedding gown embroidered with delicate silver holly leaves. She carried no jewels except Eleanor's tiny snowflake brooch, which Henry and Lucy had asked her to wear. As Clara walked toward the altar, Rowan realized he no longer felt torn between past and present. He carried Eleanor's memory with gratitude. He welcomed Clara with love. Both truths peacefully belonged inside the same heart. Their vows were quiet, honest, uncomplicated. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, applause filled the chapel. Mrs. Agnes gently raised her hands. Without speaking, she began conducting the forgotten Christmas hymn. Clara sang the opening line. Rowan joined the second. Henry and Lucy entered on the third. Then something extraordinary happened. One by one, every servant who had worked beside Eleanor added their voices. The villagers followed. Stable boys, kitchen maids, gardeners, children. Even Mrs. Talbot sang despite insisting for years that she possessed no musical talent. The tiny chapel transformed into a choir Eleanor herself had once dreamed of creating, where noblemen stood beside laborers, children beside elders, every voice carrying equal warmth beneath the snow-covered roof. Outside, great white flakes drifted gently toward the earth. When the final note faded, Henry looked toward the falling snow and smiled through shining eyes. "Father," he said quietly, "Mother didn't come back." Lucy slipped one hand into Clara's and the other into Rowan's. "No," she answered softly. "She simply kept the promise she made without ever telling us." Rowan looked toward the chapel window where snow covered the distant outline of the old stone well. At last he understood what Eleanor had entrusted to the future. She had never prayed for someone to replace her. She had prayed for someone whose kindness would carry forward the love she could no longer give herself. Standing beside Clara with Henry and Lucy smiling between them, Rowan realized that Christmas had not returned because the past had been forgotten. It had returned because love, faithfully planted years before in a forgotten mountain village, had finally come home, and its beautiful song would echo through Ashcombe Manor for generations to come.